the sickness unto death, the despair of not being oneself. The ceiling is a strange canvas at 3 in the morning, a flat, indifferent surface waiting for the light that won't come for hours. The quiet of this hour is always deceptive. It's not true silence. It's just the absence of external noise, leaving the floor open for the mind's internal monologue to finally take the stage and scream. This, I think, is the hour of the Dane, not the hour of the wolf, but the hour when the cold dread of existential philosophy finally sets in, when the body seeks rest but the spirit refuses the comfort because it is gripped by an illness far deeper than insomnia. It's an illness you can carry your entire life without ever getting a proper diagnosis. Kierkegaard gave it a name, the sickness unto death. We mistake this title. It doesn't mean the sickness leads to death. It means the sickness is the despair over the impossibility of truly dying, or rather the inability to escape the eternal self. The sickness is despair, and despair for Kierkegaard is not just sadness or grief over a specific misfortune. It is the condition of the self when it fails to be itself. To understand the illness, you have to understand the self. The self, he tells us, is a relation that relates to itself, a synthesis. We are a balancing act between warring elements, the finite, our body, our job, our time, and the infinite, our spirit, our potential, our eternal nature. We are the temporal tied to the eternal. We are necessity bound to possibility, and the despair sets in when that synthesis breaks. We become unbalanced relations that fail to relate to the very I we were meant to be. We tend to think despair means losing something, a relationship, status, health. Kierkegaard says that is only the superficial symptom. The true despair is failing to possess oneself. It's the sickness of being alienated from your own spirit. There are 3 primary forms, but the most common, the one that grips most of us silently in the middle of the night, is the despair of weakness. It is the refusal to accept the self that one is. We look at the unique, difficult, complicated markings of our own spirit and we say, no, I'd prefer a simpler life. I'd prefer to disappear. We try to flee the self, to erase the painful individuality that God, or the power that established us, etched into our being. We seek refuge in conformity, anonymity, and the comforting dullness of the average. We desperately want to become merely an everyone. We crave the narcotic of the collective, hoping that if we are indistinct enough, we will evade the responsibility of existing as this specific one. We choose to live life as a series of footnotes, desperately afraid of ever writing the main text. But the finite self is grounded in the infinite. We are built to relate to the power that established this relation in the first place. If we define ourselves purely by things that pass away, our career, our political tribe, our consumption patterns, we are trying to anchor the infinite part of our soul to the finite. We are trying to fill an eternal void with temporal dust. The result is always the same, a profound, existential hollowing out. We look around and see a life that is objectively successful, perhaps, but subjectively meaningless. We feel the deep, persistent numbness of having lost ourselves while successfully gaining the world. Look at the synthesis of necessity and possibility. When that balance is lost, despair follows instantly. Take the despair of necessity. This is the bureaucrat, the functionary, the man who is suffocated by routine. Every step of his life is predictable. He is locked down by the present and refuses the breath of freedom. He has lost the possibility to become anything other than what he already is. He is a cog, predictable, reliable, but spiritually dead. He has forfeited his self by becoming merely a function of the mechanism. Then look at the opposing failure, the despair of possibility. This is Hamlet. The man paralyzed by endless choice. He sees a million paths and takes none. His potential haunts him because he never actualizes anything. He is everywhere and nowhere. He evaporates into pure thought, pure potentiality, failing to root himself in the necessary, finite world of action. He has lost his self by refusing to take the necessary risk of commitment. He loses his grip on reality because his spirit flies too high, unanchored. In both cases, the man suffocated by routine, the man paralyzed by freedom, they are refusing a dimension of their self. They are rejecting the specific synthesis they were meant to embody. The tragedy of the sickness unto death is that you can have it, live with it, and not know you are dying from it. We medicate it with distraction, drown it in noise, or busy ourselves with pointless anxieties. But the sickness remains, the refusal to be the self one truly is. That is the ache keeping me awake. The knowledge that the self, this demanding synthesis, knows it has failed to relate rightly to itself. It has refused its own terrifying nature. The greatest danger is not that we might die, but that we might live without ever having been ourselves. And until that authentic self is finally affirmed in all its terror, its ambiguity, and its profound responsibility, we will not find rest, not in this bed, and certainly not in the silence beyond. The night remains very long indeed. Abyss of freedom, living in the vertigo of possibilities. The clock reads 2:47 a.m. It is the hour when the world shrinks down to the size of the room, and the room shrinks down to the size of the skull. The distractions are gone. The noise has faded. Now, there is only the terrifying clarity of silence. Sleep is refusing entry tonight because the gatekeeper is asking too many questions. And those questions are all about possibility. We romanticize freedom. We paint it blue and soaring. We treat it as an innate good, a guarantee of happiness. But freedom, viewed in the desolate mirror of 2:47 a.m., is not happiness. It is vertigo. It is the dizzying knowledge that every single path, the one you took today, the one you avoided, the one you are still considering for tomorrow, is equally open. The world, the self, the future, they are pure, unformed clay, and the responsibility for shaping them is exclusively yours. This is the abyss that Søren Kierkegaard first mapped. He recognized that the deepest human emotion is not simple fear. Fear has an object, a spider, a physical threat, a market crash. Anxiety, or angst, is objectless. It is the awareness of freedom itself. It is the feeling Adam must have had before eating the apple, not knowing what disobedience was, yet knowing he had the power to disobey. The awareness of the ability to choose the infinite, even if that infinite leads to ruin. The terrifying realization that we are suspended over existence by nothing but our own will. Kierkegaard defined this feeling as the possibility of possibility. It is the dizziness that accompanies the sheer volume of routes available to us. Routes that do not end in success or failure, but simply in the transformation of who we are. Every decision is an act of self-creation, and therefore an act of self-destruction of the other potential selves. And we dread it. We dread the responsibility so deeply that we spend our lives constructing systems, social, ethical, religious, political, designed solely to eliminate freedom, to eliminate the need for the absolute choice. We hide in the crowd. We adopt the aesthetics and ethics of the general public, the statistical average, because conformity feels safe. It allows us to exchange the agonizing terror of being an individual for the comfortable numbness of being a number. We try to become interchangeable, to blend into the universal template, so that when we die, it is merely the extinguishing of a generic type, not the unique, irreplaceable loss of a soul that defined itself. But Kierkegaard warns that this evasion is the greatest betrayal. True life, the ethical life, the self-actualized life, demands the leap. The leap is not rational. That is the point. If the choice could be proven right beforehand, it would not be a choice. It would be following an algorithm. Faith, in the existential sense, is the courage to choose absolutely when the evidence is incomplete, or contradictory, or non-existent. It is the knight of faith who, having lost everything, chooses to believe he will get it back, not because logic suggests it, but because he chooses to inhabit the absurd. He chooses to live passionately within the uncertainty. We are paralyzed, caught between the infinite promise of freedom and the finite horror of commitment. We wait, hoping for certainty to arrive in the morning mail. We read endless articles, collect data points, seek advice from gurus and algorithms, all in an attempt to turn a moral choice into a mathematical equation. But the choice waits for no one. The refusal to choose is itself a choice. The choice to let contingency or external pressures choose for us. The possibility, unchosen, calcifies into fate. And so, here we sit, 2:47 a.m., wide awake, caught in the undertow of our own magnificent, terrifying potential. We are waiting for a certainty that will never arrive. The only way forward is down, to choose the terrifying fall into commitment, to assume the weight of our own existence, and to finally, defiantly, choose who we are. Perhaps only after that choice is acknowledged, that leap taken, can we finally earn the peace required to close our eyes. The three stages of existence: aesthetic, ethical, and religious. We talk so easily about freedom, but we usually mean the freedom to choose within a predetermined set of rules. We rarely confront the freedom to define the rules themselves. The first stage, the aesthetic, that's easy to understand. It is the immediate, the momentary. It's the pursuit of pleasure, the avoidance of boredom. Don Juan, Nero, the perpetual swipe right. It's living in the hyphen between moments, never connecting them. It's a beautifully hollow existence, ultimately defined by despair, the despair of never choosing anything eternal, of refusing the gravity of commitment. So, we mature. We enter the ethical stage, the judge. Here we embrace the universal. We accept duty, responsibility, marriage, career, the laws of the land. We become reliable. We stop trying to be unique and start trying to be good, measured against the standard. This is the great comfort, security through conformity. We sacrifice the thrill of the momentary for the stability of the perpetual. The ethical life is fundamentally sound, predictable, and reassuring. It says, do your duty and you will be safe. And for most people, this is the destination, a well-ordered life, a respectable life. But Kierkegaard saw the trap hidden within this very respectability. If I submit entirely to the universal, if my identity is entirely derived from my role, father, citizen, professional, where did I go? The ethical stage is a tyranny of the average. It demands that I become everyone, and in doing so, I cease to be anyone at all. The horror begins when you realize the ethical system, designed to save you from chaos, also prevents you from reaching true selfhood. It's like being eternally protected by a heavy blanket, warm, safe, but preventing you from standing up and walking into the wind. To move beyond the ethical is not to reject responsibility, but to suspend it, temporarily, teleologically. It is the moment the individual understands that their duty to the absolute, to God, or to their own radically singular self, supersedes their duty to man. This is the religious stage. It is the leap. And leaps, by definition, involve gravity and the terrifying lack of footing. Kierkegaard gave us the perfect symbol for this terror. Abraham walking up Mount Moriah with Isaac. Every ethical code screams, stop, this is murder. Yet Abraham, the knight of faith, must obey a private command that no one else can validate or understand. He must stand alone, utterly silent before the universal, betting everything on the paradox. We forget that the religious stage is founded on fear and trembling. It is not comfort. It is radical instability. It is the recognition that the self is spirit, and spirit is possibility, and possibility is dread. We are terrified of the choice because we are terrified of the freedom that makes the choice real. Dread, or angst, is not fear of something specific. It is the dizzying realization of freedom itself, the acknowledgement that the ground beneath us is not fixed. Faith, then, is the act of maintaining that terrifying freedom without collapsing into despair. It is not a settled doctrine or inherited dogma. It is a continuous, strenuous passion, a subjective certainty held in the face of objective uncertainty. It is believing by virtue of the absurd. The aesthetic man seeks the immediate. The ethical man seeks the universal. The religious man seeks the singularity, the self that only exists in isolation, upheld only by the irrational momentum of the leap. We cannot rationalize the religious stage. If we could, it would simply be another part of the ethical system. We cannot explain the knight of faith. Outwardly, he looks exactly like the tax collector, the insurance adjuster, the respectable neighbor. But inwardly, he has made the infinite movement of resignation, followed by the absurdity of the finite return. He has bet his eternity on the paradox. I am suspended here, like the self before the leap. I have catalogued the aesthetic failures, embraced and then outgrown the ethical standards. Now, I stand at the precipice of my own existence, where the comfort of the universal fades, and the terrifying responsibility of becoming an irreducible I demands recognition. The ultimate despair is the unwillingness to be oneself. The ultimate faith is the decision made in the dark to be that self, fearfully, trembling, alone, and finally awake. Leave your like. The aesthetic stage, fleeing boredom and the trap of pleasure. I've been waiting for sleep again. It's a strange, voluntary exile, this space between the day's action and the night's oblivion. It brings me back to the problem of boredom, not the dull, momentary kind, but the existential dread Kierkegaard diagnosed, the profound vacancy at the center of a life lived only for amusement. The aesthetic stage. It's seductive. It promises intensity, variety, and the constant avoidance of anything dull. The aesthete, the seducer, the dandy, the brilliant but aimless intellect, arranges life as a spectacle, a never-ending series of stimulating moments. The goal is to maximize pleasure while minimizing commitment. But the pursuit of pleasure is, ironically, the fastest route to true boredom. Why? Because pure sensation is ephemeral. It demands constant escalation. We chase novelty, but novelty quickly decays into habit, and habit breeds repetition. The aesthete must continually destroy his previous self to make room for the next, more thrilling iteration. He is perpetually fleeing himself. Kierkegaard saw clearly that the opposite of pleasure is not pain, it is boredom. And the opposite of boredom is not amusement, it is meaningful commitment. The aesthetic stage is ultimately despair masked by distraction. The individual living solely for the moment denies the coherence of time. The past holds only regrets, and the future holds only obligations he refuses to take on. Everything is sacrificed to the tyranny of the now. And beneath the veneer of constant stimulation lies the terrifying realization that nothing really matters. Kierkegaard suggests that the greatest danger is not suffering, but the smooth, anesthetic avoidance of suffering. If we are never forced to confront the abyss, we never feel the need to leap. We are simply comfortable, and comfort is the death of the soul. Think of the diary of the seducer, the centerpiece of Either Or. Johannes, the seducer, does not truly desire the woman. He desires the process of the seduction. Once the conquest is complete, the object loses its charm. The victory is empty, and the search must immediately begin again. He is a connoisseur of possibility, terrified of concrete reality. This is the trap of pleasure. It binds you to the external world, to the things that can be consumed. It promises liberation through variety, but delivers a new, more refined form of slavery. You become dependent on the stimulation, needing more of the world to fill the hollowness inside. So how does one escape the aesthetic prison? Not by trying harder to be entertained. That only doubles down on the error. The escape route is the recognition of despair. It is the moment when the aesthete, tired of the endless rotation, looks into the mirror and sees a fractured self, a life composed only of fragments, none of which add up to a whole person. This recognition demands a leap. The leap is a choice, an ethical commitment to the self and to others. It is the willingness to choose the heavy, durable substance of responsibility over the light, dazzling surface of amusement. This is the move to the ethical stage, where one chooses not the moment, but the self who chooses. One accepts the limitations and the duties of existence, but even the ethical stage, with its demands for universality and reason, eventually hits its limit. It offers stability, but not salvation. It is where Kierkegaard leaves the safety of philosophical systems entirely and introduces the true terror and the true freedom, the necessity of faith. The only way out of the boredom of the aesthetic and the limitation of the ethical is the leap into the absurd, the religious stage. The knight of faith, who embraces contradiction, who accepts the absolute demands of the individual over the relative demands of the universal. This leap requires fear, the profound, singular anxiety that comes from standing alone before God, without the comfort of societal norms or aesthetic distraction. It is the forgotten truth that true selfhood is forged not in pleasure, but in dread, and sealed in a radical, terrifying act of trust. We wait for sleep, just as we wait for the courage to leap. And in that waiting, the silent, terrifying question remains: what is it you truly want to commit to, and what are you willing to fear? The ethical man, duty, choice, and the weight of the universal. We all wait for something, waiting for the light to change, waiting for the rain to stop, waiting for an answer to come. Tonight, I am waiting to sleep. It's an involuntary act, falling asleep. You can't force it. The harder you try, the further away it slips, like a thought you almost had. And while I wait for that surrender, I find myself circling back to Block 5, the ethical man. We started with the foundational stones, duty and choice. And then we hit the wall that every serious thinker eventually hits, the universal. The ethical life, as Kant mapped it out, is clean, precise. If I act only on the maxim that I can simultaneously will to be a universal law, I am good. It's a mathematics of morality. It's comforting because it removes the terrifying weight of singularity. It says, if you do the right thing, everyone should do the right thing. The ethical mandate is what binds us, what makes society possible. But what happens when the universal principle demands a betrayal of the unique, the singular? What happens when the duty to the abstract man conflicts with the love for the concrete, this man? This is where Kierkegaard walks in, a sharp pebble in the shoe of comfortable ethics. We avoid Kierkegaard because he is uncomfortable. He forces us to look at Abraham, not the sanitized stained glass Abraham, but the man on Mount Moriah, knife raised, ready to shatter every ethical bond known to man, to kill his son. The ethical man says, "Thou shalt not kill." Murder is the absolute contradiction of the universal law that protects society. Yet Abraham is celebrated in the tradition as the father of faith. Why? Because for Kierkegaard, Abraham was operating on a different plane. He was caught between the ethical, which demanded Isaac live, and the divine command, which demanded Isaac die. He was suspended in the teleological suspension of the ethical. This is the terrifying leap, the moment when the individual, through faith, places their relationship with the absolute above the claims of the universal. It is a moment of total isolation, of pure existential loneliness. There is no universal law that covers Abraham's action. If everyone were to follow Abraham's example, the world would descend into chaos. Abraham's act is non-transmissible. It is a terrifying burden borne by one soul. Kierkegaard reminds us that sometimes the weight of the universal is a form of escape. It's a way of hiding from the terrifying choice that defines us. We love duty because it means the choice has already been made. But true existential choice, the choice that defines the self, happens in the silence, in the terrifying freedom of the individual before God or the void. It requires the leap into the unknown. What does that leap feel like? It feels like fear, profound, dizzying fear. We are so obsessed with being happy or being successful that we forget the essential human condition, anxiety. Kierkegaard called it angst. It is not the fear of a specific thing like a barking dog or a failing grade. It is the dread born of freedom. It is the dizzying realization that I can choose, and that choice is ultimate, terrifying, and mine alone. This is the forgotten truth. The ethical life is a beautiful structure. but it can never capture the raw, terrifying singularity of the human heart facing its ultimate destiny. The leap of faith is not a comfortable doctrine. It is a profound risk, a radical surrender of safety. To be an ethical man is to live within the walls of the universal. To be a man of faith is to stand alone in the storm, trusting that your singular choice, your secret contract with the absolute, will somehow justify the terrifying silence. Tonight, waiting to surrender to sleep, I wonder, how many choices do we make purely out of duty, and how many are true leaps? And if I were called, could I bear the weight of singularity? The answer, of course, is silence. The sleep is still waiting, and the choice, as always, is still mine. Night of Faith, Abraham and the Paradox of the Absurd. The deepest hours of the night are not silent. They are merely quiet enough for the existential hum to rise above the static. It is in this solitude, where the world shrinks down to the size of your own skull, that the easy comforts of daytime morality begin to peel away. We speak of faith as a choice, an affirmation, a gentle embrace. But that is the Sunday school version, the gloss applied by those who never felt the knife edge of the real thing. To understand faith, true faith, we must travel to the lonely hill with Abraham and feel the terrifying absurdity that Søren Kierkegaard unearthed. We live securely in the ethical sphere. The universal law is our anchor. Do not kill, protect the innocent. This is the foundation of civilization, transparent and necessary. But what happens when the singular personal relationship with the absolute, with God, commands the suspension of that universal rule? This is the terror of Abraham. His act, the preparation to sacrifice Isaac, is ethically nothing less than murder. If he were acting for the good of the state, like the tragic hero Agamemnon sacrificing Iphigenia, we could rationalize his grief, we could pity him, he would still be noble. But Abraham acts for God alone. He is silent, utterly isolated. He cannot explain his duty, because the moment he tries to translate it into universal terms, the terms of the ethical, it becomes indefensible violence. His faith is a radical private wager made in the darkness. It is the moment where duty and goodness cease to align, where the only thing left is a terrifying obedience to the incomprehensible. This is the paradox of the absurd. Abraham must simultaneously hold two contradictory beliefs. First, God commands Isaac's death, and he will obey. Second, by virtue of the absurd, by the power of the promise, he will receive Isaac back. This is not a certainty that God will intervene before the blade falls. That would be mere patience. True faith, for Kierkegaard, involves the double movement. The first movement is infinite resignation. It is the heartbreaking, rational act of letting go. Abraham must give up Isaac forever, burying all hope that his promise will be fulfilled in this world. He must resign himself to the fact that his life, his lineage, everything he values is eternally lost. This resignation is pain, but it is rational pain. But the night of faith does not stop there. The second movement is the leap, the radical return to the world, armed with nothing but belief in the impossible. He receives Isaac back, not through resignation, but by virtue of the absurd. He believes that because all things are possible with God, he will receive him again in this life, physically, through the power of the absolute ridiculous. The night of faith looks mundane. He drinks his coffee, pays his taxes, smiles at his wife. But his soul moves in an entirely different dimension. He possesses everything he has lost, because he knows he has nothing apart from the divine gift. He is not a hopeful man. He is a man certain of the impossible. We, standing in the shelter of the universal, long for a faith that offers guarantees. We seek comfort. Kierkegaard offers us dread, isolation, and the necessity of leaping across a void of understanding. To move beyond the universal is to risk everything, your reputation, your sanity, your place in the world. That quiet, lonely terror, the realization that the only path to becoming a true individual is to embrace what the world calls madness, is the price of Abraham's faith. It is the ultimate wager made in the stillness of the early morning, before the ethical world wakes up to judge. It is the truth of the absurd, forgotten, yet always waiting just beyond the edge of our sleep. Anxiety, anguish, the presentiment of freedom, facing nothingness. The room is silent, but the silence is only external. Inside, the noise is deafening, a low, humming dread that settles in the chest precisely when the day's necessary distractions have been put to rest. We call it insomnia, but sometimes it's just the raw, unavoidable confrontation with the self. This isn't the fear of a looming deadline or a sudden concrete physical threat. That is fear. This, the pervasive spiritual tremor that keeps us suspended between waking and dreaming, is something else entirely. The Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard gave it a specific, terrifying name: angst, anguish. We translate it as anxiety or dread, but it carries a fundamental philosophical weight that those English words often fail to convey. It is the spiritual acknowledgement of the price of consciousness itself. Fear is focused. Fear looks outward, pointing at a definite, tangible object, a car hurtling toward us, a threat in the immediate distance. Anguish, Kierkegaard argues, looks inward. It points at nothing at all. It is the emotional state that confronts pure potentiality. It is the dread we feel not because we are trapped, but because we are so devastatingly free. Imagine standing on the edge of a great, dizzying precipice. You feel the instinctual fear of falling, yes, but then a different, colder thought pierces through the panic. The terrifying realization that you are absolutely free to jump. Not forced, not pushed, but free to elect your own destruction, your own complete removal from the chain of being. That dizzying moment, that paralyzing sense of absolute, self-defining possibility, that is anguish. It is the presentiment of freedom facing nothingness. Kierkegaard frames this sensation in the story of Adam. Before the fall, Adam lived in innocence, which is a state of blissful ignorance regarding the self. But even in that perfect garden, there was a quiet, qualitative nothingness stirring beneath the surface, the possibility of being able to choose the forbidden. That very possibility was the whisper of anxiety. It was not a demonic voice, but the sound of his own innate freedom ringing in his ears. Once the choice is made, innocence is lost forever, replaced by the weight of self-awareness and the crushing responsibility of freedom. This is the paradox of human existence. We are condemned to be free. We are the synthesis of the temporal and the eternal, the finite and the infinite. And because we are constantly facing a horizon of infinite choices, each choice negating a universe of other possibilities, we live in perpetual anguish. The self we are actively becoming is built on the quiet graveyard of the selves we failed to choose, the paths we were too afraid to take. Every significant decision is, in a way, a tragedy of lost potential. It is impossible to live a fully authentic life without feeling this dread, because the anxiety is merely the shadow cast by our capacity to transcend our current state. It reminds us that we are never finished, never fixed. So, what do we do with this fundamental dread that defines the human condition? We cannot think our way out of it. Reason is what brought us here, showing us the terrifying expanse of what we might be. We cannot distract ourselves permanently. Eventually, the silence returns. Kierkegaard offers a singular, terrifying solution: the leap. Not a careful step, but a massive, desperate leap of faith. The leap into the unknown, beyond the boundaries of reason, into the realm of the absurd, where personal commitment and passionate belief replace objective certainty. It is the willingness to affirm oneself despite the underlying nothingness, despite the terror of absolute responsibility. It is the willingness to bet your entire existence on the meaning you create. And so, here we lie, suspended between the tick of the clock and the vast, empty space where sleep should be. The dark room is not merely empty, it is pregnant with choices unmade and choices yet to come. This waiting, this subtle agony of the mind is not a failure of will or a simple chemical imbalance. It is the proof of our ultimate distinction. It is the recognition that freedom, in its purest, deepest sense, is the most terrifying gift we possess. Tomorrow, we rise and leap again. Tonight, we simply confront the silence. Moment, instant, the point where time touches eternity. There is a particular kind of silence that only arrives in the deep hours of the morning. It's the silence that holds the room after the last thought of the day has been exhausted, but before the first worry of the new day has begun its shift. We lie there, suspended, waiting for the physiological click that permits us to surrender consciousness. We wait for sleep, but what we are truly waiting for is the moment we cease waiting. This waiting itself is fertile ground for anxiety, not fear necessarily. Fear has an object, a deadline, a danger, a shadow in the hall. But anxiety, or dread, as Kierkegaard defined it, is the vertigo of freedom. It is the awareness of possibility. We are free to choose, and the infinite possibilities inherent in that freedom produce a profound and terrifying instability. We dread the unknown precisely because we are, in a very real sense, the authors of it. We stand at the precipice of every potential future, burdened by the realization that we are fundamentally responsible for the self we become. Kierkegaard asks us to look closely at this state of suspension, this point of transition. He calls it øyeblikket, the instant, the moment. It is not just a slice of linear time, moving us from yesterday to tomorrow. It is the critical junction, the paradoxical point where time touches eternity. Time, in the ordinary sense, is always moving away from us. It is succession, loss, the steady ticking down toward a known end. Eternity, however, is not simply unending time. It is the absolute presence, the essential now. The moment is where we stand outside the endless chain of cause and effect and are given the opportunity to initiate something fundamentally new. It is the birthplace of history because it is the location of the decisive choice. It is the point of contact between the perishable and the everlasting. This brings us to the famous or infamous concept, the leap. We exist across three spheres: the aesthetic, driven by immediate pleasure and sensation; the ethical, governed by universal rules and duty; and the religious, which demands a personal, terrifying confrontation with the absolute. The transition between these spheres is never logical. You cannot reason your way from duty to faith. The moment demands a break, a fracture, a radical departure from the safety of the known and the observable. It demands the leap. The ethical man lives by the universal. He knows absolutely what is right and what is wrong. Thou shalt not kill, thou shalt honor thy commitments. He is safe in the community of shared values. But the man of faith, Kierkegaard illustrates through the story of Abraham and Isaac, faces a situation where the ethical mandate is temporarily suspended by a higher, intensely personal, and utterly illogical demand from God. This is the ultimate paradox. Abraham must stand alone, understanding that his action is monstrous by all ethical measures, yet simultaneously rooted in a terrifying trust that transcends those measures. He doesn't just believe in God. He relies on the sheer, awful possibility of the absurd. To achieve faith, one must first execute the movement of infinite resignation. You must give up everything. Accept that the object of your desire is lost forever, yet follow that immediate despair with the absurd faith that, based on sheer impossibility, you will receive everything back. It is a terrifying dance on the razor's edge of madness. This is why faith is so rare. It requires a trembling solitude, a willingness to be judged by the world as insane, reckless, or unforgivably arrogant. We avoid the moment because the moment requires the risk of self. It requires us to abandon the comfort of the universal, the refuge of being simply one of the many. We prefer the safety of the crowd, the reassurance that our choices are predictable and sanctioned. Yet every essential choice we make, who to love, what to dedicate our lives to, how to respond to suffering, takes place in this instant where the finite meets the infinite, where eternity breaks through time. The risk is that you might be wrong, the uncertainty is overwhelming, But the certainty is that if you do not risk, if you avoid the existential friction of the moment, you have already lost. You have chosen to remain defined by the aesthetic shadows of passing time. We must choose in the silence of the morning, in the solitude of the soul, and stand ready for the tremor that follows. We must take the leap, not into the darkness, but into the blinding, terrifying light of our own essential and unconditioned freedom. We must choose, even as we wait to sleep. Subjectivity is truth. Why passion matters more than reason. The silence before sleep is a tribunal. We lie here, dismantling the day's architecture of certainty, and the deeper subterranean hum of existence begins. It is the sound of time passing without apology. We call it fear, but Kierkegaard gave it a proper name: angst. Not the measurable anxiety of a specific threat, but the profound, nauseating dread that accompanies absolute freedom. It is the dizziness of standing on the precipice of possibility, knowing that every choice is unrepeatable and that there is no universal handbook for the single existing individual. For decades, maybe centuries, we have been obsessed with building systems. We want the objective truth, the neat, interlocking logic that provides consensus and safety. We inherited the belief that the bigger the system, the truer the reality. Kierkegaard saw this as the ultimate dodge. He looked at the vast, glorious structures of Hegelian philosophy and asked a devastatingly simple question: where is my map? Where is the space for the passionate, finite, flawed human being caught in the immediacy of his own life? The truth is not external. It is not found by stepping back and observing the machinery of the universe. The truth, the meaningful truth, is found in the way we relate to the world. If I hold an objective truth, say, the Pythagorean theorem, with utter indifference, what genuine truth value does it have for my life? None. It is a sterile fact. But if I hold a partial, uncertain, perhaps even logically absurd proposition with the passion of infinite concern, that engagement, that intensity transforms the quality of the truth. It becomes internal. It becomes real. Subjectivity is truth because meaning resides in the how, not the what. This realization is unbearable to the rational mind. Reason demands guarantees. It demands safety rails before we cross the bridge. Passion, true passion, demands the leap. This is the leap of faith, and it is horrifying because it requires the temporary suspension of the ethical, the social, the rational. It is an act committed alone. Think of Abraham on the mountain. He was faced with an absolute decision that contradicted everything the ethical community held sacred. His action was not rational, it was not universal, it was singular, absurd, and terrifying. It was an act of faith, and faith in the Kierkegaardian sense is not a comfortable belief. It is a terrifying action against the observable evidence. It is the continuous conscious risk of losing everything, including one's standing in the world, in order to gain oneself. We try so hard to avoid the sheer terror of singularity. We live the aesthetic life, chasing pleasure, avoiding commitment, until it curdles into boredom and despair. Or we retreat to the ethical life, living safely within the boundaries of social duty, becoming a cog in the wheel, but losing the possibility of becoming truly individual. But the highest stage, the religious stage, which is really the stage of true existence, requires the constant acceptance of dread. It means standing naked before the highest commitment, knowing that no one, no logic, no system can justify your final choice. The world outside preaches calmness. It tells us to be reasonable, moderate, predictable. But the quiet of the night reminds us that the only way to escape dread is to acknowledge its necessity. To live truly is to embrace the anxiety of the absolute choice. We cannot reason our way into the fullness of being. We must choose it passionately, recklessly, and without a net. To gain the self, we must be willing to risk the universe. Sleep awaits, but the leap is perpetual, and in that terrifying uncertainty, we find the only certainty that matters. The leap of faith, the choice. Logic cannot make. The clock keeps ticking in the silence. It is the sound of time being spent, not saved. When you try to count backward from a terrifying choice, you inevitably hit the wall of the rational. We spend our lives building comprehensive systems, ethics, economics, mathematics, all designed to eliminate contingency. We crave predictability. We want the proof before the purchase. We demand a guarantee that the risk will yield a measurable reward. But the highest choices, the ones that define the soul, never offer a receipt. They exist outside the ledger of cause and effect. They demand an action that logic cannot validate, an investment that reason condemns. This is where Kierkegaard corners us. He forces us to look past the parlor room philosophy and stare directly into the vacuum of choice. He forces us to confront the terrifying limitations of the ethical life. The ethical life is necessary. It is the sphere where we learn duty, reciprocity, and social responsibility. But it is not the ultimate destination. It is merely the middle ground, built on the assumption that if we follow the universally accepted rules, the outcome will be universally good. But what happens when the rules fail? What happens when the path demanded by the collective system is exactly what restricts your unique, absolute relationship with the infinite? We feel this dilemma as dread, not the fear of something specific like an approaching storm, but the dizziness of freedom. It is the paralyzing recognition that we are fundamentally unbound, and that if every action could be calculated, we would be machines, not spirits. If the path forward was logically inevitable, there would be no faith, only deduction. The tragedy, Kierkegaard argues, is that the moment of highest existential intensity is often the moment we are least able to explain ourselves to the world. He points us toward Abraham, the knight of faith, demanding that we look beyond the sanitized Sunday school version of the story. Every ethical system demands Abraham protect his son, Isaac. God demands the opposite. Logic is screaming, do not do this. You will be a murderer. You will violate the most sacred bond of existence. But Abraham does not calculate probabilities. He suspends the ethical entirely. He steps beyond the universal, beyond what any neighbor can judge or advise. He chooses the absolute. He chooses the duty to God over the duty to man. And here is the impossible, absurd point. He takes the knife believing, not hoping, but believing that God will give Isaac back. He moves toward the sacrifice, believing the finite world will be radically restored. That is the double movement. That is the terrifying leap into the absurd. The leap of faith is terrifying precisely because it is illogical. It is not the final, satisfying theorem after a long proof. It is the rejection of the theorem. It is the violent, singular movement away from the safety net of reason and into the boundless air. It is a move made in profound isolation, because no rational human can follow you or validate the decision. If you can justify it, if you can draw a clear arrow from action A to predictable result B, it isn't faith, it's merely prudence. The decision must be self-contained, self-authenticating, and fundamentally ridiculous to anyone standing on the shoreline of logic. We want a bridge that spans the chasm between the ethical and the religious. Kierkegaard gives us an abyss and commands us to jump. And so, we lie here, waiting for the exhaustion to grant us the temporary reprieve of sleep. We are trapped between the comfort of knowing what is right, the safety of the ethical universal, and the demand of existence to choose what is real, the terrifying freedom of the individual. The truth Kierkegaard left behind is this. The crucial decisions of human life are defined by the very criteria we try hardest to eliminate: uncertainty, risk, and the absolute possibility of failure. The only thing that truly matters is the thing that cannot be quantified, cannot be reasoned away, and must be grasped through the terrifying, glorious act of the solitary leap. The logic stops running right here in the dark, and we are left alone with the choice. The individual against the crowd, the danger of being lost in the we. The moment before sleep is a strange country, a silent stadium where the lights are out, and the only sound is the echo of the day's relentless noise finally dying down. And sometimes, in that silence, you hear the quieter things, the the truths you spend all day forgetting. Tonight, I keep circling back to the crowd. Not the physical mass, the subway rush or the concert density, but the metaphysical crowd, the we. We are taught that the ultimate moral achievement is assimilation, to think as the group thinks, to feel the collective outrage, to trade your difficult, jagged edges for the smooth anonymity of the communal mindset. It is a powerful temptation. The crowd offers shelter from the unbearable responsibility of selfhood. It's warm, it's loud, and you never have to be wrong alone. You're simply right by consensus. But this is where Kierkegaard walks in, a sharp-edged ghost in the Danish fog, and delivers the most terrifying assessment of human existence. The crowd, morally and spiritually, is untruth. When you join the mass, you gain safety, but you lose accountability. The average standard of courage, of intelligence, of conviction drops instantly. The mass simplifies. It dilutes the unique, challenging mandate given to every single person to become an individual. Think of the things we fear most: being judged, being ostracized, being singled out. These fears drive us towards the we. We trade our inner life for outer validation. We stop asking what is true for me and start asking what is acceptable to us. And this is the danger. Once you are lost in the consensus, you cease to be a moral agent. Your conscience is outsourced to the loudest voices in the collective. You become a function of the crowd rather than a thinking, existing soul responsible for its own choices. Kierkegaard forces us to acknowledge that the highest achievements in faith, in creativity, in ethical depth are always accomplished by the individual standing alone. Abraham alone on the mountain, Galileo alone in his observation. The true moral leap is always performed without a net, without the comforting affirmation of the general public. This is the meaning of the leap into the unknown. It's not just a leap of faith into God, it's a terrifying leap away from the security of the societal norm. It is the decision to become a self, defined by absolute isolated choice, rather than a reflection of popular opinion. What does it take to stand against the tide of the age? It takes fear, not the fear of consequences, but the absolute dread of possibility. The paralyzing realization that you are fundamentally free, and that freedom is terrifying because it means you are completely responsible for the person you become. Kierkegaard called this existential vertigo, the dizziness caused by looking down into the abyss of your own freedom. We try to anesthetize this fear with the collective hum of social media, with the constant affirmation that everyone is feeling the same way, thinking the same thing. But the fear is the engine. It is the catalyst that forces the individual to choose authenticity over comfort. If you don't use that fear, that dreadful, beautiful freedom to define yourself, the crowd will define you, and that definition will always be shallow, generalized, and ultimately meaningless. So, as the world outside goes dark, and the we momentarily disperses into scattered, isolated homes, ask yourself, when the voices are gone, who is left? Are you still a moral agent? Can you locate your conviction without referencing the common pulse? The sleep we are waiting for is just a temporary rehearsal for a greater isolation. We enter it alone, and ultimately, we will all face the final judgment alone. The forgotten truth is that we must spend every waking moment preparing for that isolation, for that singularity. We must cultivate the soul that is strong enough to stand utterly without support. We must become the individual. Everything else is distraction. Everything else is untruth. The paradox of suffering, the necessity of pain for consciousness. It's these hours, suspended between the noise of the day and the silence of the dream, where the true arguments of the self begin. We wait for oblivion, but the mind insists on wakefulness, probing the edges of the necessary darkness. And what the mind probes first is the resistance it feels, the necessary friction we call suffering. We spend our lives engineering comfort, eradicating friction, striving for a zero-pain existence. But what if pain isn't the flaw in the design? What if it is the operating system itself? If the brain's primary function is pure biological survival, then physical pain is merely the urgent alarm bell. a signal to move the hand from the flame. But consciousness demands a different kind of wound. Existential suffering, the ache of knowing that this moment is finite, that choice is inevitable, that meaning is self-generated, that is the crucible in which the true I is forged. Without that resistance, without that constant subtle fire, we remain soft clay. The paradox is brutal simplicity. We must suffer to know we are truly awake. Comfort lulls, pain clarifies. This clarification brings us directly to the edge of the abyss that Kierkegaard mapped. He understood that the modern attempt to rationalize away suffering was merely an attempt to escape selfhood. His core insight wasn't about fear, it was about dread, the terrifying German word, Angst. Fear has an object, a closing door, an impending diagnosis, the specific loss of a relationship. Fear is concrete and therefore manageable, but dread is objectless. It is the dizziness of freedom itself. Dread is the realization that the paths stretching before you are utterly meaningless until you impose meaning upon them. It is the awareness that you are perpetually becoming, yet never truly arriving. The suffering inherent in consciousness is not the suffering of tragedy, but the agonizing suffering of responsibility. It is the terrifying freedom to be the sole author of your own disaster or your own salvation. This recognition, the moment we truly stand alone, is agony, but it is the necessary agony of self-creation. And once dread grips us, reason offers no clean escape. Logic can dissect the components of the world, but it cannot resolve the terrifying necessary tension between the infinite desire and the finite self. This is why Kierkegaard forces the hand, the ethical life, the life lived within comfortable societal rules, seeking universal applicability, is fundamentally inadequate for the individual soul grappling with its unique limitations. The moment of true personalized suffering demands more than just being good. It demands faith, not faith as passive dogma, but faith as a wild, irrational leap, the movement of infinite resignation, where you give up everything guaranteed by the world only to gain yourself back through a terrifying, absolute commitment. It is the leap into the unknown, executed precisely because the known world, the world of comfortable suffering, has utterly failed to sustain the spirit. The true self is revealed in the space between the despair of the present and the impossibility of the solution. That space is pure pain, pure focus. It is the moment the canvas of thought is stretched taut. This forgotten truth, that pain is not an interruption to life, but the very mechanism of its deepest realization, is our most vital inheritance. Every profound shift in history, every great artwork, every moment of genuine personal expansion is preceded by the refusal to accept the anesthetized norm. Our capacity for suffering is the defining characteristic of our consciousness. It is the depth of the shadow that reveals the intensity of the light we seek. When we stop trying to erase the dark strokes on the canvas, when we understand that the highest form of awareness is earned through friction, through the tearing and repairing of the soul, then perhaps we finally realize what it means to be truly awake. And perhaps only then can we earn the silence we seek, not the silence of oblivion, but the profound quiet that follows the completed thought. We wait to sleep, but the work of suffering continues, etching the soul in preparation for the dawn. We suffer, therefore we are, and in that suffering we find the courage to leap. Subscribe. Repetition, the impossible movement of finding the same with fresh eyes. The room holds the sound of my own silence. It's that hour, the profound edge of the day, where sleep, that necessary daily submission, has decided to skip me. I am suspended in the void between Tuesday and Wednesday, performing the ritual of trying to shut down. The careful arrangement of the pillows, the conscious slowing of the breath, the mental cataloging of the day's failures. It is a meticulous, desperate performance of repetition. I did this yesterday. I will do it tomorrow. But tonight, the performance fails to achieve its intended consequence. And in that failure, the mind, starved of oblivion, begins to turn inward, tracing the philosophical contours of the very idea that keeps us sane, the ability to start over. We are taught to treat repetition as routine, as rote memory, as simple iteration. We mistake repetition for memory itself. We believe we can go back to the source, to the pure, untainted moment, simply by replaying the tape. We think repeating an action means retrieving a state whole. But the great, forgotten truth is that repetition is the most impossible of movements. Kierkegaard understood this deeply. He knew that the only way to move forward was through the radical act of return. Repetition, Gjentagelsen, is not recollection. Recollection looks backward, accepts loss, grieves the fact that the original moment is gone forever, existing only as a beautiful shadow. Repetition, however, demands the original back. It demands that you stand on the exact same corner, utter the exact same promise, feel the exact same terror, but approach it with eyes that have seen the absolute unknown. To truly repeat is to find the same path, the same love, the same crisis, but to find it fundamentally transformed by the history you have just lived. It is the singular movement that sustains freedom. Because freedom isn't the first choice you make. It is the continuous, terrifying choice to live the same life, newly affirmed, newly seized from the abyss. And this is where the fear rushes in, the anxiety that Kierkegaard mapped so fiercely. Repetition demands the leap. It is the leap into the known, which through the terrifying action of the leap becomes unknown again. We must move forward precisely because we cannot stand still. We fear repetition because it forces us to confront the fact that we cannot escape the self. We can only refine the terms of its existence. We cannot undo what was done, but we must choose to do it again, or choose its counterpart, knowing that the past choice now colors the future one. The aesthetic man is crushed by repetition because he seeks novelty. The ethical man is bound by repetition because he seeks consistency. But the man of faith understands that repetition is neither novelty nor consistency. It is the transcendence of both, achieved through the absolute singular weight of individual decision. The fear is the proof that the movement is genuine, that this is not habit, but the conscious, terrifying choice of self-renewal. I'm still waiting for sleep. The stillness is absolute now, broken only by the sound of my slow, deliberate breath. I'm waiting for the moment when the loop breaks, when the conscious thought finally collapses into necessary surrender. If I manage to sleep and if I wake up tomorrow morning, that awakening won't be a simple continuation of tonight. It will be the successful repetition of existence. The impossible movement will have been made. I will open my eyes and find the world, the exact, familiar, impossible world, fresh again. The coffee cup will be in the same spot. The light will fall through the same window pane. The obligations of the day will be identical to the obligations of yesterday. And yet, it will be new. And that, more than any miracle or sudden revelation, is the definition of true repetition. That is the leap of faith we make every single dawn. To find the same, and yet to find it new. It is the simple, crushing burden of starting again. I close my eyes, I will try to forget, and then I will try to return. The silence of God, the absence that forces inner choice. It is the deepest hour, the one where the world finally exhales and silence takes its throne. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of quiet. And in that ultimate quiet, we hear the true, echoing emptiness that surrounds us. We live our lives striving for affirmation, for a signal, a proof that we are not wholly alone in the cosmos. But the signal never comes. What we mistake for the background hum of the universe is, in fact, the resounding silence of God. This silence is not a passive event. It is the profound, active absence that defines the whole geography of our dread. It is the condition of our freedom. If God spoke constantly, offering directives and reassurances, we would not be free. We would be automatons of compliance. We would not require faith, we would only require perfect hearing. Kierkegaard understood this terrifying truth better than any philosopher of his time. He recognized that the ultimate religious reality is not found in the comfortable certainty of dogma or the universal moral code. It is found in the crucible of subjectivity, standing utterly alone on the edge of an abyss. The silence of God is delegated sovereignty. It is the moment we realize we are not being watched over in the protective, intervening sense we crave. We are being watched over only insofar as we are forced to choose. And the choice is terrifying because there is no universal law, no objective, verifiable spreadsheet to validate the path we take. We spend our lives trying to escape this predicament. We wrap ourselves in the ethical, the universal rules, the accepted norms of society. Because they offer collective comfort, they whisper, "You are not an exception." But true faith, the leap, demands the suspension of the ethical. It demands that we become an exception, accountable only to an inner, unprovable command received in the dark. Think of Abraham. The ethical demanded that he protect his son, Isaac. The divine, in its ultimate silence, seemed to demand the opposite. Abraham could find no refuge in the universal. He had no logical argument, no witness, no scientific data to support his action. He stood at the edge of the knife, alone in the terrible isolation of subjective truth. That isolation, that complete breakdown of external support, is the sound of God's silence. It is the requirement that the leap, if it is to be a true act of faith, must be into the absurd. Faith is not a warm blanket woven from tradition. It is the infinite risk. It is staking your entire existence on a possibility that every rational metric screams is impossible. It is believing, not in spite of the absurd, but because of it. If God's presence were a certainty, where would the passion lie? Where would the infinite earnestness, the fear and trembling reside? It is the inherent, unresolvable uncertainty fostered by that divine absence that forces us into radical self-creation. We are terrified of the dark corners of the soul, not because they are empty, but because they are exactly where the choice must be made. The silence strips away the distraction, the chatter, the ethical safety net, leaving only the choosing agent. To choose in the face of the silence is to define ourselves without external validation. It is to accept that the burden of meaning-making rests solely on our shoulders. The void does not answer, but it commands a response. And that response, that radical choice made in existential solitude, that is the only proof we ever receive. It is not proof of God's existence, but proof of our own. It is the terrifying, beautiful freedom granted by an empty microphone. So we wait here, in the quiet suspended between dread and possibility. The world outside has gone still, and in this stillness, the work of defining who we are begins, because no one is going to tell us. The silence demands everything, and in its perfect vacuum, we finally hear the sound of our own hearts deciding what to believe. The despair of finitude, being a prisoner of body and time. The quiet is never really quiet, is it? It is just the sound of the world ending outside the sealed box of our existence. Lying here, waiting for the necessary oblivion we call sleep, the mind begins its inventory. This inventory always starts with the body. The first, most enduring horror of consciousness is being a prisoner of finitude. This shell, this sack of blood and bone, is a heavy anchor dropped into the quicksand of time. We spend our lives trying to forget this inescapable truth, that we are defined by the moment we cannot hold and the space we cannot leave. We possess an engine built for infinity, trapped inside a mechanism designed for a lifespan. I can map galaxies in my head. I can construct impossible architectures of logic and metaphysics, yet I am defeated by a common cold, betrayed by a knee joint, and ultimately measured by a 70-year calendar. The despair of finitude is simple. I can imagine eternity, but I will only ever experience a few decades, confined by skin and gravity. Kierkegaard knew this dread better than anyone. He understood that despair wasn't just sadness or psychological malaise. It was the failure to choose oneself in the face of the infinite. It is the dizziness of freedom. When we stand at the precipice of possibilities, the future that hasn't happened yet, we don't feel excitement, we feel terror. That terror is angst. It is the realization that everything is possible and therefore nothing is guaranteed. We are the synthesis of the finite and the infinite, and that combination is inherently unstable. We are both bound and unbound, and in that profound instability, we must choose who we are going to be. We try desperately to escape this instability. We try the aesthetic life, chasing sensation, distracting ourselves with noise and pleasure, moving constantly to avoid stillness. The ultimate failure of the aesthetic, Kierkegaard argues, is boredom, the sickening realization that repetition diminishes joy until nothing matters anymore. We try the ethical life, structuring ourselves through duty, rules, and community expectations. We become the function of a system, hoping that order will banish the chaos of choice. But the ethical cannot account for the ultimate crisis, the moment when a rule must be broken for a higher non-rational purpose. It cannot account for the individual's solitary demand for ultimate meaning. And so we are pushed toward the religious, the third most terrifying sphere, the place where reason ends. This is where the forgotten truth lies. You cannot think your way to faith. You cannot argue your way into eternal hope. You must leap. You must embrace the absurd. The leap of faith is the terrifying act of choosing to believe in something that defies every rational structure we've built. It is Abraham, walking up the mountain, prepared to raise the knife against every moral and rational objection. The leap is not merely believing in God, it is choosing oneself absolutely, knowing that you stand alone before the vast silence of the universe and acting in a way that reason calls madness. It is finding the sublime in the impossible. This is the only path out of the prison of the body and time. If we try to solve the eternal with finite tools, with logic, with pleasure, with moral codes, we will remain paralyzed, staring at the ceiling, trapped forever in the analysis of our own constraints. But if we make the leap, we accept that our life is not a problem to be solved, but a reality to be lived entirely on faith. We accept the fear, but we act anyway. We acknowledge the body as a boundary, but we embrace the mind as a boundless, terrible freedom. We are prisoners of body and time. But the one liberty that remains here in the silent dark is the choice to define our shackles or to make the dizzying, lonely leap out of them. And as the necessity of sleep finally calls and consciousness begins its slow, dissolving retreat, we are left only with that fundamental choice to surrender to the finite or to embrace the terrible, magnificent weight of the unknown. The despair of infinitude, living lost in dreams and abstractions. It's the worst time, this slow, deliberate failure of the lights. The brain, unwilling to surrender its complex circuitry to the quiet mechanics of rest. I wait for the drop, the inevitable slide into unconsciousness. But the mind remains stubbornly upright, polishing the same old knife edges of abstraction. Every night, the same confrontation. Sleep should be a simple cessation, a temporary death. But for me, it is the threshold of infinitude. The despair isn't just in being awake, but in being unbound. When the world outside goes silent, the internal world gains total jurisdiction. It's an intellectual vertigo. I stand on the precipice of limitless possibility, the infinite ways I could have lived, the infinite truths I could still pursue, and the sheer weight of that freedom keeps me paralyzed. Abstraction is a comfort until you realize it's also a cage, built entirely of potential that can never be actualized. We are meant to be finite, to exist within boundaries, yet our defining faculty demands the boundary be pushed, erased, ignored. We become trapped in the conceptual architecture of a life that can never be truly built. This is where Kierkegaard still owns the room. He understood that the true affliction isn't fear, which has an object, a spider, a fall, a recession. The affliction is dread, or angst. Dread has no object. It is the overwhelming realization of freedom itself. It is the dizzying acknowledgement that tomorrow, or perhaps right now, I have the capacity to choose absolute change or absolute ruin. The emptiness of the future is terrifying, not because it might be filled with bad things, but because it is empty enough for me to fill it with anything. That void, that infinite potentiality, sucks the oxygen out of the present moment. We cling to the present routine, the known suffering, because the alternative is the vast, open sea of self-determination. The mind, faced with true freedom, experiences the terror of a compass spinning with nowhere fixed to point. The intellectual trap is that we become spectators to our own existence. We stand apart, refining the theories of how a life should be lived, while refusing the terrifying risk of living it imperfectly. We develop impeccable philosophies of commitment, only to shrink from the actual act of commitment. I can analyze the aesthetic life, the ethical life, and the religious life, categorize their merits and their faults. But the moment I step off the ledge, the moment I cease being the observer and become the participant, the theories scatter like dust. The deepest despair is knowing the map perfectly, having charted every reef and current, yet never leaving the shore. We prefer the safety of endless theoretical potential over the concrete risk of defining ourselves, of being definitively, irrevocably wrong. And so, we arrive at the necessary absurdity, the leap. Kierkegaard didn't call for logic. He called for faith, not necessarily faith in a dogma, but faith in the concrete singular self. It is the ultimate movement away from infinitude and toward the definite. It is the terrifying, irrational commitment to this moment, this choice, this imperfect trajectory, knowing full well that objective proof is impossible. The leap is the surrender of all abstraction, the refusal to hedge bets with potential. It is the single, isolated individual standing alone before the unknown, making a non-reversible wager on meaning. The crowd is safe in its collective reason. The singular self must find courage in its terrifying irrationality. The ethical demand is always finite. The existential choice is always infinite, and the true faith lies in choosing the finite despite the presence of the infinite. That terror is beautiful. It is the price of definition. Tonight, as the clock grinds its way toward 4 a.m, I realize the waiting is the ultimate act of avoidance. The true leap isn't into God or love or career. The first true leap is the surrender to sleep itself, the act of trusting the unknown, letting go of the control required to sustain the endless abstractions. It is the momentary abandonment of the mind's infinite domain for the body's simple, necessary collapse. And as the thoughts finally begin to slow, the dread lingers, not of falling, but of finally ceasing the analysis of the fall. The analysis is the only thing keeping me upright. It is the final abstraction I must abandon. Shadow of sin, the consciousness of separation from the absolute. The longest war we fight is not external but internal. It is the cold, relentless civil war waged in the moments just before sleep, when the noise of the day has receded and only the echoing chamber of the mind remains. It is here, in the oppressive silence, that we are forced to confront the absolute solitude of being. We talk so easily about sin. It's a relic of morality, a checklist of offenses, lying, cheating, stealing. But Kierkegaard, that magnificent melancholic Dane, understood sin not as an action, but as a condition, a state of absolute ontological terror. Sin is not breaking a rule. Sin is the consciousness of separation. Imagine the absolute, the divine oneness, as a perfect, blindingly brilliant sun. We, the human consciousness, are fragments, broken mirrors spinning away from that central heat. Sin is the felt distance of that orbit. It is the acute, agonizing realization that we are adrift, utterly alone in an indifferent universe. This is why true introspection is always accompanied by a profound wave of anxiety. When you cease the frantic distractions, the scrolling, the drinking, the incessant planning, and finally sit in stillness, you meet the void where the absolute used to be, and that void whispers, "You are separate. You are responsible for the gap." We spend our entire waking lives building bridges over this gap, Career, family, philosophy, dogma, these are all intricate, expensive engineering projects designed to convince us that we are still connected, still whole, still safe within the warm current of the collective. But then comes the night. The moment the lights dim, the bridges collapse. We are left standing on the edge of the precipice, exposed to the sheer drop that is our own freedom. Kierkegaard called this dizziness angst. It's often translated poorly as anxiety, but it's heavier, colder than that. Angst is the feeling of freedom staring back at you. It is the terrifying possibility of infinite choices, none of which are inherently validated by the universe. And out of this terrifying freedom, the shadow emerges, the shadow of sin. It is the realization that the separation is self-imposed, a choice we make every moment we refuse to truly embrace the terrifying, paradoxical call of faith. Faith, in this context, is not belief in historical claims or theological doctrines. That's easy. Faith, for Kierkegaard, is the absolute, illogical leap across the void, an embrace of the absurd. It is the willingness to abandon the safety of the universal, logic, reason, the herd, and step into the loneliness of the particular. To become the solitary knight of faith, like Abraham, willing to sacrifice the dearest thing you possess because God, the absolute, demands it, even if every law of ethics screams against it. We fear this leap. We fear the loss of our intellectual anchors. We fear the scrutiny of those who stayed safely on the shore of convention. This fear paralyzes us. And in that paralysis, in that refusal to leap, lies the continuous reproduction of sin, the maintenance of separation. So as we wait for sleep, watching the shadows lengthen and twist on the ceiling, we are trapped. We are too afraid to truly separate ourselves from the crowd and become an individual before God, which is the definition of faith. And yet, we are consumed by the consciousness that we are separated, which is the definition of sin. We oscillate, minute by minute, between the terror of the leap and the despair of remaining behind. This oscillation is the core human condition. The only way out is through. The leap into the unknown, the absurd resignation, the terrifying embrace of solitude. Only then does the shadow recede, and the possibility of returning to the sun, the absolute, emerge, not through merit but through paradox, not through knowing but through daring, and perhaps then we can finally sleep. Love as a paradoxical resolution, a faith in the other. The worst hour is always the one spent waiting to sleep. It is in the residual quiet, when the protective logic of the day finally collapses, that we confront the actual dimensions of our life. The world shrinks to the size of the room, and then, inevitably, to the terrifying scale of the self. This is the space Kierkegaard described long before the lights went out. The anxiety we feel is not fear of a known threat, a looming catastrophe, or a specific loss. It is pure dread, or angst, the dizzying, existential realization that everything is possible, and therefore, every outcome is equally unguaranteed. We spend so much time trying to build rational fortifications around the heart. We want love to be an ethical contract, a predictable outcome derived from measurable input. We try to neutralize risk. We look for reassurance, for guarantees, for empirical proof that if we invest X, we will receive Y. But the moment we demand certainty from love, we have already killed it. We have reduced the infinite possibility of the other person to a finite, manageable account ledger. We turn a free relationship into a mutual insurance policy. Kierkegaard's forgotten truth is that the greatest choices we make must be made in the utter absence of evidence. To choose love is to confront this terrifying lack of ground and choose to leap anyway. It is the movement of faith applied not to the divine but to the profoundly human. To reach that point, we must first enact infinite resignation. We must acknowledge fully and rationally that we will lose the beloved. Not just metaphorically, but truly. They can leave, they can change, they can choose differently, they can die. We must let go of all claims, all entitlements, all rights to ownership of their future. We must resign ourselves to the fact that they are fundamentally free, and that freedom is the greatest threat to our security. Only once the rational mind has accepted this absolute loss, once the heart has resigned itself to solitude, can the second movement occur, the leap of faith. This is the paradoxical resolution. Love resolves the anxiety of isolation, the dread of being a self trapped within its own limits, by doubling the stakes. I am no longer merely responsible for my own existence. I am now willingly, irrevocably woven into the trajectory of another sovereign, unpredictable soul. I choose to make myself vulnerable to their suffering and their potential absence. The paradox rests here. Peace is found not in controlling the other person, but in the unwavering commitment to the uncertainty of the other person. You do not place faith in their perfection. You place faith in their freedom. To have faith in the other means accepting that they are not merely a reflection of your needs, but a universe unto themselves, a universe that possesses the full, terrifying capacity for betrayal, abandonment, or transformation. And yet, I choose to remain. This leap is the difference between sentimentality and genuine commitment. Sentimentality loves the idea of the beloved. Commitment loves the messy, unpredictable reality of the one who stands before you, free to walk away, yet choosing, day by day, to stay. When we commit, we grant the other person the power to wound us more profoundly than anyone else can. And the faith we hold is the quiet, paradoxical trust that they will use that profound power, not to destroy, but to build something entirely new. It is a decision that defies all actuarial logic. It requires a complete surrender of control, of the desperate need to engineer happiness. That's what allows the sleepless mind to settle. The realization that love is not a fact discovered, but a future created. We stop trying to prove it, and we simply start living the commitment. In that terrifying, beautiful surrender, in that faith in the other, we finally find the grounded weight of our own existence. Becoming oneself, an infinite and solitary task. The clock ticks loudest when you are trying to be quiet. It's the sound of the universe reminding you that time is passing, whether you are building or collapsing. When the day's noise recedes, when the light shrinks to a slit beneath the door, you are left with the only real work: becoming. Becoming oneself is not a destination. It is the infinite and solitary task laid before every consciousness. We often treat identity like an archaeological dig, a buried thing waiting to be uncovered, cleaned, and labeled. But that is the fatal mistake. You don't find yourself. You perpetually create yourself. Kierkegaard understood that authenticity is the never-ending authorship of a life that has no final draft. You write the sentence, and before the ink dries, you must be ready to rewrite the ending, because the conditions have changed, because you have changed. It is a process demanding courage, not certainty, and the world hates this kind of work. The world offers the solace of the collective, the warm oblivion of fitting in. It asks you to trade the terrifying originality of your own spirit for the safety of common belief. We are told to rely on averages, on statistics, on what most people would do. We are conditioned to seek consensus before conviction. But selfhood, the essential, enduring self, is never found in the crowd. It is forged in the harrowing isolation of the choice. To truly become, you must first withdraw. You must face the terrifying realization that no one can make the final, crucial decisions for you. Your deepest truths must be whispered only to yourself. In the darkest room of the night, this isolation breeds anxiety, angst, not merely fear, but the dizzying awareness of total, inescapable freedom. The freedom to be glorious, or the freedom to be absolutely nothing. This anxiety is the entry fee for selfhood. It's the tremor you feel standing at the edge of the unknown, realizing that the bridge you must cross is made only of your own will. This is the existential shudder, the fear and trembling that precedes any meaningful action. We try to escape it. We distract ourselves with routines, relationships, or the relentless consumption of temporary pleasures. But every distraction is just a postponement of the essential meeting, the self meeting the self. Kierkegaard insists that you cannot rationally calculate your way to selfhood. Logic is comfortable, but it is too small for the demands of the soul. The defining moments of our lives are always illogical. They require a leap, a passionate, defiant act of faith into the absurd. This is the leap into the unknown. We leap away from the universal, away from what is safe, and land hopefully in the profound particularity of our own existence. We become the exception to the rule, the subjective truth that defies objective categorization. To choose oneself is to choose the risk of being fundamentally misunderstood by everyone else. It is to choose the radical exception over the comfortable rule. It is a solitary decision that must be renewed every single day, precisely because the self is always in motion, always dissolving and reforming. And yet, here we are, waiting for sleep, the greatest surrender, the temporary death that resets the clock. We spend our lives building this intricate, complicated self, only to have to dismantle it slightly every night, trusting that it will reconstruct itself authentically by dawn. The task remains infinite. The solitude remains absolute. It is a terrifying burden, yes, but it is also the highest honor, the continuous creation of something unique, something transient, something fiercely and terrifyingly your own. Go to sleep now. But remember that the work of becoming starts again the moment you open your eyes. It is the work of a lifetime, measured in every breath and in every solitary tick of the clock. The serenity of the absurd, finding peace in the uncertainty of faith. The night is often the worst accountant. It demands totals when all we have are variables. We lie here, suspended between the chaos of the day and the utter blankness of the unconscious, and the silence allows the real questions to sneak in, the ones we can't answer with logic, the ones that terrify the soul. The modern mind seeks comfort in systems. We crave a formula for stability, a predictable blueprint for spiritual success. But genuine faith, Kierkegaard understood, is inherently anti-systemic. It is a lonely, dreadful affair, an act of singular, painful isolation. It is not adherence to a comforting creed. It is a leap off a cliff when you cannot see the bottom, driven by a conviction you cannot logically defend. We forget that he didn't write about quiet assurance, but about fear and trembling. He forced us to confront the fact that the ethical life, the beautiful, comforting life defined by universal laws, by thou shalt not kill, is ultimately inadequate for the person attempting true faith. The ethical binds us to humanity. Faith demands that we cut that bond temporarily, completely, in favor of a private command. The story of Abraham and Isaac is not a moral lesson. It is a horror story intended to snap the mind. It is designed to show us the limit of the universal. Abraham is asked to commit murder, an act that would place him outside the ethical community, outside all human understanding. If he spoke of his intention, he would be judged insane or wicked. The ethical demanded he stop. God demanded he proceed. This is the teleological suspension of the ethical, a moment where the divine purpose overrides the universal human law. Abraham had to stand utterly alone, justified only by a relationship that was private, non-transferable, and profoundly absurd. And that is the core truth we try so hard to rationalize away. Faith is inherently absurd. It requires us to believe, against all evidence, that the impossible will happen, that the God who demands the ultimate sacrifice will, at the last moment, restore what was taken, or terrifyingly, that the sacrifice itself is the restoration. How do you find peace in that? You don't. Not initially. You find trembling. You find fear. Because the commitment cannot be an easy affirmation. If it isn't terrifying, it isn't real. If you can explain your faith completely using philosophy or science, then you have reduced the infinite to the finite, and you are believing in a theorem, not a transcendent reality. The serenity comes only after the leap, in the aftermath of total surrender. It is the understanding that human reason, while magnificent for navigating the physical world, breaks down completely at the threshold of the divine. When reason fails, we are left with only the willingness to commit to the unknowable. This willing embrace of the absurd, this willingness to stand with Abraham, ready to proceed even when the universal judgment is condemnation, that is where the tension dissolves. It is the realization that the uncertainty is the definition of the relationship. We spend our lives searching for certainty, hoping to abolish fear. But perhaps the greatest act of faith is holding the fear tight, knowing that we are standing exactly where we are supposed to be, on the precipice, dependent entirely on a truth that cannot be articulated, only enacted. Sleep still seems far away, but the panic is receding. The demand for a rational answer is quieting. Sometimes finding peace isn't solving the riddle. It's accepting that the riddle is meant to remain unsolved. It's accepting the absurdity. And in that quiet acceptance, there is, strangely, rest. Either or, the urgent necessity of choosing existence. The deepest hour is not midnight. It is the hour just before sleep truly arrives, when the mind, deprived of distraction, begins to consume itself. We lie in the soft, dark velvet of inertia, pretending the world outside the blanket does not demand an answer. We pretend the gravity of our life choices has been suspended for the evening. We are taught that life is a spectrum, a gentle gradient of compromise. We believe in negotiation, in finding the perfect synthesis between conflicting desires. But that is the great, comforting lie of the lukewarm. Existence, Kierkegaard whispered from the shadows, is not a spectrum. It is an ambush. It is not shades of gray. It is either or. We spend decades perfecting the art of non-choice. We float, hoping gravity will eventually decide our destination. We believe that by accumulating options, we somehow avoid commitment. But the great terrifying pivot point is this: indecision is the most profound, irreversible decision of all. The aesthetic life, the life defined by novelty and distraction, eventually collapses into boredom and despair. It is the realization that you have become nothing more than a spectator in your own life, watching opportunities pass, avoiding the terrifying responsibility of becoming concrete. You are a draft, forever waiting for the final edit. And then comes the dread, the vertigo of freedom. It is the sickening awareness of the abyss of possibility, the fact that everything I am about to become rests entirely on a choice I must make, a choice that lacks any rational guarantee. This moment, suspended between wakefulness and oblivion, is the urgent necessity of choosing existence. We want truth to be a logical structure, a comforting syllogism derived from objective data. But the truths that matter, the truths of love, of commitment, of faith, are inherently absurd. This is why faith is not comfortable devotion. It is terror. We are all standing on our own private mountain, deciding whether we dare to raise the knife to our own aesthetic self, the self that just wants to observe and enjoy, never to suffer the burden of responsibility. The tragic figure is not the one who makes the wrong choice, but the one who never makes a choice at all. They look back and realize the structure of their life was built by the avoidance of decision, brick by gray, passive brick. And the moment of reckoning arrives not with a bang, but with the quiet realization that the possibility of becoming who you were meant to be has slipped away. The world is demanding an answer right now, not tomorrow, when the coffee is hot and the sun is high and the noise provides cover, but here, in the quiet dark, where the self is naked and undefended. Will you embrace the terrifying weight of the leap? Will you choose the ethical burden of being this specific person, committed to this specific path? Or will you continue to drift, anesthetized by the promise of future possibilities, until the dark absorbs you entirely, and you realize that your life was spent waiting to sleep? The pillow calls, and the choice, urgent, irreversible, and terrifying, is all that remains. The teleological suspension of the ethical, when faith overrules morality, the kind of dark that feels less like an absence of light and more like a heavy, velvet presence. When the clock ticks slower than your heart, and the air itself seems to demand something profound, it is in this hour that the mind stops reviewing the mundane failures of the day and starts chasing the impossible questions. We map the terrifying territory of the soul, charting our necessary journey through the great cities of existence. We spend most of our lives striving for the ethical. The ethical stage is the magnificent structure of civilization, its universal law, duty, fairness, and shared responsibility. It is loud, public, and demonstrable. It is the language of contracts and compassion. It tells us what is right, what is wrong, and why we owe one another everything. But Kierkegaard whispered a terrible, sleepless secret. The ethical is not the end. The universal human law, he argued, must sometimes be shattered by the absolute divine command. He called this moment the teleological suspension of the ethical. The goal of faith, the absolute, suspends the ethical command. It is the moment when the horizontal plane of human obligation is violently pierced by the vertical bolt of divine instruction. We recall the paradox of the night of faith, the terrifying contradiction of acting by virtue of the absurd, moving beyond self-interest, beyond the greater utilitarian good, solely for something uniquely, tragically absolute, moving beyond human reason and into divine madness. This is not the comfortable mysticism of organized religion. This is the radical isolation defined by fear and trembling. The moment requires total, unspeakable solitude. When you enter this stage, you can explain your actions to no one. If you try to explain your private calling ethically, society labels you insane or dangerous. The ethical demands transparency. Faith demands silence, because faith cannot be universalized. It is always a private telephone line. Just as the archetype of faith stood alone on the mountain, his justification was not demonstrable fact, but a commitment so fierce it defied every category of human logic. He traded the comfort of universal duty for the terror of absolute individuality, and that is why we think of these things late at night under the weight of the dark, because we all face that leap, the moment when the carefully constructed rules of the day crumble, and we are left only with the terrifying choice to remain safely within the known boundaries of morality, or to risk everything, our reputation, our sanity, our very definition of humanity, on a quiet internal whisper. Sleep feels like a small suspension, a temporary turning off of the lights. But faith is asking us to suspend everything, permanently, just for the hope of a dawn we cannot possibly describe. And that is why we still fear the dark, because the dark is where the ethical stops speaking and the absolute begins to call. Irony and the art of indirect communication. The quiet of the late hour has a certain tyranny. It strips away the clutter of the day, leaving only the bedrock of the self, exposed and vulnerable, staring up at the ceiling, waiting for the merciful collapse we call sleep. And when the distractions fade, the real questions emerge, questions that logic cannot satisfy, which is precisely where the conversation with irony begins. Irony, for the great thinkers, was never just a form of sophisticated sarcasm. It was a strategy, a philosophical discipline. It was the art of indirect communication, essential for conveying truths so subjective, so terrifyingly personal, that to state them directly would be to rob the recipient of the necessary struggle. Kierkegaard understood this better than anyone. He wrote indirectly, hiding behind pseudonyms, because he knew that eternal truth cannot be dispensed like a formula in a lecture hall. You cannot be told the truth of your existence. You must be lured into discovering it for yourself through agonizing solitary introspection. The irony is the distance, the subtle, necessary gap between what is said and what is meant. It compels the listener to become active, to take a leap of interpretation. And this necessary leap of interpretation mirrors the ultimate leap, the leap of faith. If faith could be proven, it wouldn't be faith. If the existence of the eternal could be demonstrated by logic, it would simply be another scientific conclusion, another form of immediate knowledge. It would be philosophy. But faith, true, terrifying faith, is the passionate embrace of the objective uncertainty. The ethical life is comfortable. The ethical life is universal. We know what is expected of us when we operate under the laws of the community. But the ethical is the common ground. Faith is the lonely terrain of the individual, standing alone, responsible for a choice that defies the universal. We want certainty. We crave a map, a formula, a divine instruction manual printed in clear, readable type. But certainty is precisely what is stripped away when we stand at the edge of the truly infinite choice. The irony is that the most vital parts of our existence, love, meaning, faith, are built upon grounds we cannot inspect. They are contingent upon a passionate inwardness, a commitment made not because of reason but in spite of it. And this indirect communication is mirrored in how we relate to our own future. We prepare for tomorrow. We make plans, we build safeguards, but we are ultimately waiting for the leap into the unknown that the next moment represents. The room is silent now. The world has stopped pretending to offer answers. It has simply offered the choice. The forgotten truth is that the greatest act of self-discovery requires a willingness to abandon the safety of logic, to step into the dark, not knowing if the ground will hold. And the terrifying beauty is that this leap, this embrace of uncertainty, is the most authentic thing we can ever do. We are alone. We must choose. And the decision, ironically, cannot be explained to anyone else. It is entirely, irrevocably our own. The secret of despair, the unwillingness to be transparent before God. The hour before dawn holds a specific, unforgiving gravity. It is the perfect confessional, because in this silence there is no one left to lie to except yourself. We spend our daylight hours constructing elaborate facades, intricate architectures of competence and control. But the cold, pure silence of midnight strips the plaster away, leaving us exposed. We are left only with the scaffolding of the soul, and in the worst hours it is leaning dangerously. We misunderstand despair. We think it is merely profound sadness, a temporary emotional state dictated by bad circumstance. Kierkegaard corrects us brutally. Despair is not the lack of what you want. It is the refusal to be who you are. It is a spiritual pathology, a sickness unto death, rooted in the spirit's unwillingness to ground itself in the power that constituted it. But the true secret of despair, the mechanism of its perpetual motion, is the absolute unwillingness to be transparent. It is the refusal to submit to the ultimate visibility. We block the final exit. We lock the door on the ultimate observer because observation demands truth. Despair thrives in the dark corners where we hoard our compromises, our flaws, and the specific acts of malice or envy we cultivate. We treat them like private treasures too shameful or perhaps too valuable to reveal. Why? Because transparency requires vulnerability, and vulnerability feels like a loss of sovereignty. It is pride manifested as self-protection. We tell ourselves that if we admit the depth of our brokenness, the true extent of the anxiety, the jealousy, the spiritual laziness we harbor, we will shatter. So we hold the pieces tight, clutching them to our chest in a desperate, exhausting act of spiritual self-sufficiency. This holding, this internal concealment, is the very mechanism of the sickness. But the silence knows, the spirit knows. And the more elaborate the hiding, the more profound the despair. The true torment isn't the suffering itself, but the requirement that you must successfully hide the suffering, thus eliminating any possibility of a cure. The concept of before God isn't about judicial punishment in this context. It is about perfect visibility. It is the realization that you are standing in a light source so absolute no shadow can form. To be transparent before God is simply to stop wasting energy trying to generate shadows where none can exist. Faith, then, is not blind adherence to dogma. It is the terrifying, active decision to stand completely naked in that light. It is the leap away from the pride that insists, I must fix myself, and toward the terrifying surrender that whispers, I cannot even see myself truly unless I am seen by the ultimate reality. It is letting the secret dissolve. Sleep still evades me, but the architecture of the night has changed, because I am no longer spending my finite energy trying to hold it up alone. The secret of despair is not that it exists, but that we insist on keeping its existence a secret. And in this small, quiet hour, the choice is clear: transparency or perpetual illness. The leap starts in the refusal to close your eyes to the truth of your own reflection. The difference between knowing about God and existing before God. The silence of the hour before true dawn is not empty. It is a waiting room. We lie here, suspended between the necessary exhaustion of the day and the terrifying renewal of the next. And in that quiet space, the mind begins to unpack the heavier baggage, the questions we carefully avoid when the lights are on. Tonight, it is Kierkegaard's central terror, the gulf between knowing about God and existing before God. We spend so much time building the fortress of the about. We read the histories, the commentaries, the systematic theologies that neatly organize the absolute into digestible footnoted blocks. Knowing about God is comfortable, it is academic. It is an intellectual pursuit where the stakes are limited to a successful debate or a passing grade. This knowledge demands nothing of our actual existing life. It is the ultimate spectator sport. We confuse the map with the territory. But the moment you transition from knowing about God to existing before God, the entire architecture of comfort collapses. To exist before God is not a position of intellectual superiority. It is an existential condition of terrifying singularity. It is to recognize that you are not merely a member of a collective, not just an average human in the census of the cosmos, but the lone, irreplaceable individual standing naked in the light of absolute accountability. You cannot reason your way into an authentic relationship with the eternal. It is the passionate, subjective intensity focused on an objective uncertainty. It is the terrifying realization that everything rational must be resigned. To exist before God is to live in a constant state of dread, not the trivial anxiety of modern life, but the profound ethical vertigo of recognizing the possibility of sin, the weight of freedom, and the demand for transformation. When you exist before God, the universe contracts. It is reduced to just two entities, the absolute and the I. There is no mediating crowd, no mitigating context. The leap is not merely believing the impossible. The leap is choosing the passion that embraces the impossible, even when all the data screams for retreat. To know about God requires a library. To exist before God requires a mirror. The difference between these two states is the difference between reading the theory of flight and jumping off the cliff. One is safe comprehension, the other is terrifying, irreversible action. And that is the truth that keeps the sincere man awake at night. We have spent 2 millennia systematizing God, neutralizing the terror, making the infinite manageable. We have traded the existential reality of the abyss for the philosophical safety of the handbook. We know about the sun, we have charted its trajectory and measured its heat, but we refuse to step out of the comforting shadow and into its actual consuming blaze. Until we do, we have missed the point of existence entirely. We are simply well-informed sleepers, and the silence of this waiting room demands that we finally choose which we intend to be.